She was never accused of anything. Yet everyone slowly stopped trusting her. Nothing in her life visibly changed. But every glance, every pause, every silence began to mean something else. What started as a single moment quietly repeated itself, then reshaped how she was remembered, until even her calmness felt suspicious. No one confronted her. No one proved anything. Yet the distance around her grew in ways she could not stop. Tonight, you are about to step into a world where nothing is said clearly, but everything is decided in silence. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment, letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If a woman in the Tudor court allowed even a single moment of visible emotion to linger too long, it could follow her longer than any spoken word. The court did not need laws to define her behavior. It had habits, and habits were stronger. Faces were watched the way others might watch written records. A lowered gaze, a controlled breath, a still posture. These were read as carefully as any document. Nothing was said openly, but everything was understood. A woman's value rested not only in her lineage or her marriage, but in how well she appeared untouched by disturbance. Calmness was not simply admired, it was expected. It suggested discipline, obedience, and a kind of inner order that reflected well on everyone connected to her. To remain composed was to remain safe. But the opposite was never spoken aloud so directly. No one announced that emotion could become a weakness. No one declared that a raised voice or a trembling hand could be remembered as something more than a passing moment. They did not need to, because once seen, it did not disappear. In a crowded hall, a flicker of irritation could be noticed by someone who had nothing else to do but observe. In a quiet corridor, a sharper tone might linger in memory longer than intended. These moments were small, almost forgettable on their own, but they were rarely kept alone. They were carried from one conversation to another, from one quiet remark to the next, until they were no longer moments but impressions. And impressions, once repeated, began to feel like truth. A woman did not need to shout to be seen as emotional. She only needed to be remembered as having almost done so. That was enough, because in a place where dignity was measured in restraint, any visible emotion could be interpreted as a lack of control, and a lack of control, even imagined, could be gently folded into something more serious, something less forgivable. There was no clear line where composure ended, and instability began. It was not defined. It was felt, and because it was felt, it could shift depending on who was watching, who was speaking, and who chose to remember. Rumors did not move loudly. They moved quietly, and they moved quickly, faster than proof, faster than denial, faster than any attempt to correct them. A single suggestion, carelessly placed, softly spoken, could begin to travel before the woman it described even realized it existed. And by the time it reached her, it no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the court, and the court did not forget easily. In such a world, a woman was not only expected to behave well, she was expected to be seen behaving well. Always. There was no private moment that could be trusted to remain private. No reaction that could be fully contained. Even silence could be observed. And once observed, it could be interpreted. A pause could be hesitation. A hesitation could be doubt. And doubt could become something much larger. It is unsettling how little was required. No accusation. No confrontation. No undeniable act. Only a perception, repeated often enough, until it settled into place. And once it settled, it rarely moved again. Her reputation was not built on what she did, but on how carefully she avoided being seen as anything less than composed. And in a court where even the smallest reaction could be carried from one whisper to another, that composure could be tested without her ever knowing when it began. Because long before a woman was called unstable, someone had already learned how to make her appear that way. She did not belong to the structure that surrounded her, yet she moved within it, as if she had learned its shape by memory. There was no place assigned to her, no title that could be spoken without hesitation, no position that could be defended if questioned too directly. Her presence existed in the same rooms, under the same light, among the same voices, but it was never meant to be acknowledged in a way that granted her permanence. And yet, she remained, not because she was secure, but because she understood how to exist without needing to be secured. A mistress did not rely on what could be written or declared. She relied on what could be tolerated, on what others were willing to ignore, as long as it did not disrupt the visible order of things. That was the first condition of her survival. She could not demand attention. She could not claim legitimacy. She could not even appear to want either. Everything she depended on was fragile, the attention of a man, and the silence of everyone else. Neither of these could be forced. Both could disappear without warning. So she learned to move carefully within that uncertainty. Not slowly, not hesitantly, but with a kind of awareness that did not need to announce itself. She watched before she acted. She understood before she appeared to understand. She noticed the patterns others overlooked, the rhythm of entrances and exits, the weight of certain conversations, the way a room shifted when particular people stood too close to one another. She did not interrupt those patterns. She waited for them, because she could not change the structure directly, but she could exist in the spaces between it. A mistress did not confront a wife. She could not. To confront was to expose herself. To force a situation into clarity was to risk being the one removed from it. Her position depended on remaining just outside the boundaries of what could be formally addressed. So she did not step forward. She remained slightly to the side, close enough to be seen, far enough to avoid being named. There is something precise in that distance. Too close, and she would be undeniable. Too far, and she would be irrelevant. She learned to remain exactly where she needed to be. And in that position, she began to understand something else. She did not need to be recognized to have influence. In a court where perception mattered more than declaration, what was seen often carried more weight than what was officially acknowledged. A moment observed could travel further than a fact confirmed. A glance could outlast a statement. And so, she began to rely on what could be observed, not on what could be proven. She did not create scenes. She allowed moments to exist, moments that could be noticed by others, moments that did not require explanation, only interpretation, moments that would not belong to her once they were seen, because once something was seen, it did not remain in her control. It moved, from one person to another, from one version to the next, each time slightly altered, slightly adjusted, until it no longer resembled the original moment at all. But by then, it did not matter, because what people believed was rarely based on where something began. It was based on how often they heard it. A mistress understood this without needing to say it. She did not build her position by asserting herself. She allowed others to construct it around her. Through attention, through comparison, through the quiet tendency to notice differences between one woman and another. Even when no one intended to make that comparison aloud, she remained composed. Not because she was expected to be perfect, but because she could not afford to be anything else. Her composure did not protect her reputation. It protected her invisibility. And invisibility, in her case, was not absence. It was a kind of freedom. Freedom to be present without being fully examined. Freedom to move without being formally questioned. Freedom to influence without needing to defend that influence. But that freedom came with limits. She could not correct what others said about her. She could not challenge what others believed. She could not stand in the center and claim space as her own. So she did something else. She allowed the center to shift. Not suddenly, not in a way that could be traced, but gradually, through small adjustments in how attention was directed, through moments that invited observation, through situations that did not accuse, but made others begin to wonder. And once the wondering began, it did not require her to continue. It continued on its own. There is something quiet about this kind of presence. It does not announce itself. It does not leave evidence in the way actions usually do. It leaves impressions, difficult to define, but easy to remember. And in a court where memory shaped reputation, impressions were enough. The mistress did not need to be stronger. She only needed to be less visible in the right ways, less exposed, less defined, less easily held responsible for what others began to notice. Because once attention moved away from her, it needed somewhere else to settle. And in that movement, something else began to take form. Not around her, but around someone who could not step out of the light. She had no name that could protect her. So she learned to exist where protection was not required, and in a place where what was seen mattered more than what was declared. That quiet presence began to carry more weight than it should have. Because once attention started to move away from her, it did not disappear. It simply chose somewhere else to rest. She did not enter the room as a person. She entered as something already defined. The moment she appeared, the space adjusted, not in movement, but in expectation. Conversation softened without stopping. Eyes shifted without seeming to move. There was a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken. She was not simply present. She represented something that had to remain intact. A wife, in the Tudor court, was not measured by affection or private understanding. She was measured by what others could see and repeat. Her composure was not her own. It belonged to the household, to the family name, to the delicate balance that held everything together. If she remained calm, then everything remained stable. If she faltered, even slightly, the meaning did not stay contained within her. It spread. There were no allowances for visible strain, no quiet permission to react as others might. What would be ordinary in another setting? A sharp breath, a delayed response, a moment of visible discomfort, became something else entirely when attached to her, because she was expected to be constant. Not sometimes, not most of the time, always. This expectation did not arrive suddenly. It formed slowly, reinforced by glances, by silence, by the way others responded to her presence. She learned it without being taught. She adjusted without being told. Her voice lowered. Her movements slowed. Her expressions narrowed into something that could not easily be questioned. It was not that she felt less. It was that she allowed less to be seen. And over time, the distance between what she felt and what she showed became something she carried without noticing. There is a kind of quiet discipline in that separation. It requires attention, but it cannot appear effortful. It demands control. But that control must look natural. If it appears practiced, it risks becoming visible. And anything visible invites interpretation. So she made it invisible. Or at least, she believed she did. Because in a place where observation was constant, nothing was entirely unseen. It could be delayed. It could be overlooked. But once noticed, it did not return to being nothing. A wife could not afford to be unpredictable. Not in how she spoke. Not in how she reacted. Not in how long she held someone's gaze. Every detail carried weight. Not always because others intended to judge, but because they were accustomed to noticing. The court functioned through attention, through the quiet recording of what seemed ordinary, until it was repeated often enough to become meaningful. And once something became meaningful, it was no longer small. A slight change in tone could linger longer than the words themselves. A moment of hesitation could outlast the situation that caused it. A look, held for just a second too long, could begin to exist independently of the moment it belonged to. It could be remembered, and memory, in such a place, did not remain neutral. It compared. It placed one moment beside another, one reaction beside another, one woman beside another. It did not announce its conclusions, but it allowed them to form quietly, beneath the surface. And those conclusions rarely favored uncertainty. They favored clarity. A wife was expected to be clear. Clear in her composure, clear in her restraint, clear in the absence of anything that could be mistaken for instability. There was no defined boundary between control and the loss of it. There was no moment where someone could say, with certainty, that she had crossed a line. But the line existed. It shifted depending on who was watching and what they expected to see. And because it shifted, it was impossible to stand safely beside it. She could only remain far from it. That distance required effort, an effort that could not be seen. She adjusted herself constantly, before speaking, before reacting, before allowing even the smallest expression to settle on her face. She anticipated how something might be received before it even happened. Not because she doubted herself, but because she understood that doubt, once introduced, did not remain contained. A single moment could be enough. Not enough to define her, but enough to begin. Because once something could be questioned, it did not return to certainty. It lingered. It waited. It attached itself to the next moment, and the one after that, until it formed something that felt continuous, something that felt consistent, and consistency, even when it began in fragments, was difficult to undo. There is something quiet in the way pressure builds under such conditions. It does not force itself forward. It settles. It repeats. It becomes part of the environment, indistinguishable from what has always been there. The wife did not resist it. She absorbed it. She refined her movements further. She narrowed her reactions even more. She learned to hold still not only in body, but in expression, in tone, in presence. And still, something remained outside her control, because perfection, once expected, does not allow for interruption, and the absence of interruption is not the same as stability. It is something more fragile, because when everything must remain unchanged, even the smallest shift becomes visible, and once visible, it does not remain alone. She was expected to represent stability, so even the smallest shift began to feel like a break in something larger, and in a place where every detail could be observed and remembered. That shift did not stay confined to a single moment. Somewhere within those same quiet observations, someone had already begun to understand exactly how such a moment could be brought into the light. There was no moment when it clearly began, no signal that something had shifted, no announcement that the way she was being seen had quietly changed. The same rooms remained. The same people stood in their places. The same patterns repeated themselves without interruption. And yet, something was no longer the same. It did not happen through a single event. It did not require a dramatic scene or a visible rupture. It formed in fragments, small, almost forgettable on their own, but difficult to ignore once they began to gather. A reaction held slightly too long. A voice that did not return to calm quickly enough. A look that lingered where it was not expected to. None of these was enough, by itself, to define anything, but they did not remain alone. They were noticed, not immediately, not by everyone, but by enough people that the moments began to exist outside of her. Once seen, they did not return to her control. They moved, quietly, subtly, into the shared space where observations became impressions. And impressions, once repeated, began to feel familiar. A moment of anger could remain just that. All brief, contained human. It could pass, dissolve, and leave nothing behind. But in a place where composure was expected without interruption, even a brief disturbance could take on weight, not because of what it was, but because of what it could be interpreted as. A raised voice, once remembered, was no longer only a voice. It became a sign, a suggestion that something beneath the surface was not as still as it appeared. The more it was recalled, the less it belonged to the moment that created it. It began to belong to her, not as a person, but as an idea. There is something quiet in the way a single reaction can be extended beyond its own boundaries. It is not stretched openly. It is not forced into something larger. It is simply placed beside other moments, allowed to echo, allowed to align with what others have already begun to suspect. And once alignment begins, it rarely reverses. A word spoken in defense could be remembered as resistance. Resistance could be remembered as agitation. Agitation could settle into something less forgivable. No one needed to say it clearly. They only needed to see it that way. And seeing, in such a place, did not require certainty. It required repetition. There is a quiet shift that occurs when observation becomes expectation. At first, a moment is noticed. Then it is remembered. Then, without anyone deciding it directly, it begins to be anticipated. People do not wait to see what will happen. They wait for something to confirm what they already believe. And once that waiting begins, every reaction carries more weight than it should. Silence is no longer neutral. It becomes tense. Speech is no longer simple. It becomes pressure. Even restraint begins to feel deliberate, as though it is holding something back rather than simply existing on its own. In this way, the space around her changes without needing to move. The court does not confront her. It does not accuse her. It does not demand explanation. It observes, more closely than before, more carefully than before, with a kind of attention that does not announce itself, but does not disappear either. And within that attention, meaning begins to settle. A tear is no longer only a tear. It becomes a sign of strain. Strain becomes fragility. Fragility becomes something that can be spoken of without being confirmed. There is no moment where she is told this has happened. No moment where she can defend herself against it, because it does not exist in a form that can be challenged. It exists in how she is seen. And once that changes, it does not return easily. She may stand the same way, speak the same way, hold herself with the same care she always has. But the meaning attached to those actions has already begun to move. And what moves in silence is rarely noticed until it has gone too far to be brought back. A single reaction was never enough to define her. Yet once it was remembered differently, it no longer remained a single moment. And as observation turned into expectation, every detail began to carry a meaning it had never held before. Within that quiet attention, the court had already begun to see not what she was, but what it had been prepared to believe. It did not begin with confrontation. There was no raised voice, no visible challenge, no moment that could be clearly named as the start of anything. What took place was quieter than that. So quiet it could pass unnoticed if not seen more than once. She appeared where she was not expected, not in a way that drew attention immediately, but in a way that felt slightly misplaced. A doorway at the wrong hour, a corridor that did not belong to her usual path, a presence that lingered just long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to be questioned. On its own, it meant nothing, but it did not remain alone. The same presence, at another time, the same stillness, in another space, the same quiet interruption, repeated without explanation. Something is unsettling in repetition when it carries no clear purpose. It does not accuse. It does not declare an intention. It simply exists often enough that it begins to feel deliberate. And once something feels deliberate, it begins to invite reaction. She did not provoke openly. She allowed discomfort to form, a glance that arrived too directly, a silence that lasted too long, a proximity that could not be easily dismissed. None of these actions crossed a boundary that could be defined. There was no rule being broken, no gesture that could be clearly condemned. And because of that, there was no clear way to respond. The wife could ignore it, but ignoring something that repeated itself did not make it disappear. She could acknowledge it, but acknowledgement risked giving it weight. Every response carried a consequence, and none of those consequences could be fully controlled once they entered the space where others were watching. Because others were always watching, not with open curiosity, but with the quiet attention that filled the court, the kind of attention that did not interrupt, but did not forget, the kind that collected small details and held them until they began to connect. A pattern did not need to be explained. It only needed to be seen more than once. And once it was seen, it did not remain neutral. The mistress understood this. She did not need to increase her presence. She only needed to maintain it. Carefully, consistently, without variation that might expose intention. The repetition itself would do the work. And when the moment came, when the wife finally responded, it would not appear sudden. It would appear expected. That was the quiet precision of it. The reaction would not be seen as a response to a single moment. It would be seen as the continuation of something that had already been forming, something that others had already begun to notice, even if they had not spoken of it aloud. And in that interpretation, the balance shifted. The mistress did not change her expression. When questioned, she remained still. Her voice did not rise. Her posture did not alter. There was no sign that anything unusual had taken place. No indication that the moment held more weight than any other. She allowed the question to exist. And in doing so, she placed the response entirely on the one who asked it. A calm answer against visible frustration did not remain balanced. It tilted, not because of what was said, but because of how it appeared. The wife, already held to a standard of composure that could not break, found herself reacting within a space that had been quietly prepared for that reaction to matter more than it should. A sharper tone, however brief, did not remain brief. It lingered, not in the words, but in the impression it left behind, because once seen, it did not belong to her anymore. It belonged to those who had watched, and they did not need to agree on what they had seen. They only needed to remember it. There is something precise in the way such moments unfold. They do not force a conclusion. They do not demand agreement. They simply create a situation in which one reaction carries more weight than the action that preceded it. And over time, that imbalance begins to feel natural. The mistress does not appear to have caused anything. She appears to have remained unchanged. And in contrast, the wife begins to appear altered, not suddenly, but noticeably, in tone, in expression, in the way she is remembered after the moment has passed. And once that difference becomes visible, it does not require explanation. It begins to define itself. Nothing she did could be named as a clear offense. Yet the repetition of small moments made them difficult to dismiss. And when the reaction finally came, it no longer appeared isolated, but part of something that had already been quietly forming. In that pattern, the line between cause and response had already begun to blur in a way that did not favor the one who reacted. The moment was not chosen at random. It appeared ordinary, almost forgettable in its setting. Voices layered over one another, movement passing without pause. A room filled just enough that no single presence could claim attention for long. Nothing about it suggested intention, and yet it had been chosen, not for what it was, but for those who would be there to see it. A crowded hall does not behave like a quiet room. It does not hold silence in the same way. It does not allow moments to dissolve unnoticed. What happens there does not remain contained. It spreads, carried by glances, repeated in fragments, reshaped as it moves. In such a space, nothing needs to be announced to be witnessed. She understood this. She did not create the crowd. She stepped into it at the right moment. Her presence aligned with a time when observation was not focused, but abundant. Enough eyes to notice, not enough to question too closely. That balance mattered. Too few witnesses, and the moment could be denied. Too many, and it might draw attention before it could unfold. She needed it to pass as natural, and so it did. The interaction itself was small, a word placed carefully, a gesture that lingered just long enough, a presence that did not withdraw when it should have. None of it crossed a line that could be clearly named. But it did not need to, because what mattered was not the action. It was the response. The wife did not plan to react. She had learned not to. She had learned to contain, to absorb, to let moments pass without allowing them to settle visibly on her face. But repetition changes something. It builds a quiet tension that does not disappear simply because it is unacknowledged. And in a room where everything was already in motion, that tension found its way out. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. A shift in tone, a pause that held too long, a glance that did not return to stillness quickly enough. It was brief, but it was seen, and once seen, it did not remain brief. A public moment does not belong to the person within it. It belongs to everyone who witnessed it. Each person carries away a version, slightly altered, slightly incomplete, but close enough to the others that it begins to form something shared, a shared impression. And impressions, once shared, do not require confirmation. They repeat themselves, from one conversation to another, from one memory to the next, until the moment becomes larger than it was. The mistress did not correct what was seen. She did not clarify. She remained exactly as she had been before, composed, still, unaffected by the reaction that had just taken place. There was no sign that anything unusual had occurred. No indication that the moment held any significance beyond what others might choose to give it. That absence mattered, because when one person remains unchanged, and another appears altered, the difference becomes visible in a way that does not need explanation. It settles, quietly, naturally. The wife did not lose control, not in any way that could be clearly stated. But clarity was not required, only contrast. A calm presence beside a strained one, a steady voice beside a disrupted tone, a still expression beside one that had briefly shifted. These differences did not need to be explained. They were felt, and what is felt in a crowded room does not stay there. It leaves, carried in fragments, remembered in pieces, reassembled later in ways that feel complete. Even when they are not. There is something final about a moment that becomes public. It cannot be retrieved. It cannot be undone, even if forgotten by some. It remains with enough others to continue existing. And in continuing, it changes what comes next. Because the next time she enters a room, she is not seen only as she is. She is seen as she was in that moment. And that moment does not remain separate. It attaches itself, quietly, persistently, until it no longer feels like a single event. It begins to feel like a pattern. The moment was small, but once it was seen by many, it no longer belonged to the moment itself. And as it moved from one memory to another, it began to carry more weight than it ever held in the room. Through that quiet spreading, what had been a brief reaction was already beginning to resemble something far more lasting. She did not defend herself. There was no attempt to correct what had been seen. No effort to reshape the moment that had already begun to travel beyond the room where it occurred. She allowed it to exist as it was. Unfinished. Unclear. Open to interpretation. And in that openness, she remained quiet, not silent in absence, but silent in a way that invited attention. A lowered gaze held just long enough to be noticed. A pause before speaking that felt heavier than the words that followed. A stillness that suggested something had been affected, even if nothing was openly claimed. It was not a performance that announced itself. It was something softer, something that could be mistaken for sincerity. A mistress did not need to accuse. She only needed to appear affected. There is a difference between speaking of harm and allowing others to believe harm has occurred. The first invites scrutiny. The second invites protection. And protection, once offered, does not always ask for proof. It responds to what it feels. She understood this without needing to explain it. Her voice remained low. Her movements remained measured. Her presence did not withdraw. But it did not press forward either. She occupied a space that seemed to hold discomfort without naming it. And that space was difficult to ignore, because those who observed did not remain neutral. They filled the silence with their own assumptions. They completed what had not been said. They connected what had not been clearly linked. A glance became concern. A pause became an injury. A quiet demeanor became a sign that something had gone too far. No one needed to ask directly. They began to conclude. And once a conclusion begins to form without resistance, it rarely meets interruption. She did not contradict it. She did not confirm it. She allowed it to settle. There is something precise in this kind of restraint. It requires an understanding that direct denial can be as disruptive as accusation. That speaking too clearly risks shifting attention back to the source. That ambiguity, when maintained carefully, allows others to move further than they might have intended. And once they move, they rarely return to where they began. The wife, by contrast, could not remain untouched by the moment. Even if she had returned to stillness, even if her voice had lowered, even if her expression had settled back into composure, something had already been seen. And what had been seen did not disappear. It lingered, not in the action itself, but in how it was remembered. Because now, there was something to compare. One woman appeared unchanged. The other had reacted. The difference did not need to be explained. It only needed to be noticed. And once noticed, it began to grow. There is a quiet imbalance in such moments. One presence absorbs attention without effort. The other becomes defined by a single reaction that cannot be separated from how it is recalled. The mistress did not increase her visibility. She allowed the contrast to exist. In contrast, once present, it does not require repetition to remain effective. It reinforces itself. Each time the moment is remembered, it returns with a slight adjustment. Each retelling smooths the edges, removes uncertainty, and strengthens the impression that what was seen was clear, even if it never was. Over time, the question of what happened becomes less important. What remains is how it felt. And feeling, once shared, becomes difficult to challenge. The wife does not hear these conclusions as they form. She does not see the way they settle into quiet agreement. She continues as she always has. Measured, composed, attentive to every movement she allows herself to make. But something has shifted, not in her, in how she is received, because now there is an expectation attached to her presence, not yet spoken, not yet defined, but waiting to be confirmed, waiting for another moment that might resemble the first. And once that expectation exists, it does not require action to continue. It carries itself forward. She did not claim harm, yet her quiet presence allowed others to believe it had already taken place. And as that belief settled without being challenged, it began to influence how every reaction would be seen afterward. From that silent acceptance, the difference between who appeared affected and who appeared excessive had already begun to take shape. Nothing was said clearly. No one stood forward to define what had changed. No accusation was spoken aloud. no direct concern expressed in a way that could be answered or denied. The court continued as it always had. Voices steady, movements measured, patterns unchanged. And yet, something had begun to move beneath that stillness. It was not carried in words. It was carried in looks. A glance that did not rest as easily as before. A pause that arrived where it had never been needed. A subtle adjustment in posture when she entered a room, as if the space itself had shifted slightly to accommodate something unspoken. No one pointed to it, but it was there. At first, it remained indistinct, too vague to name, too quiet to confront. It existed in the space between what was observed and what was acknowledged, and because it was not clearly defined, it was difficult to resist. She could not respond to it. There was nothing to answer, no sentence to correct, no claim to deny, no voice to challenge. Only the sense that something in the way she was being received had altered, even if no one admitted it directly. And in that absence, interpretation began. A reaction once seen became easier to recall. A moment once noticed became easier to reference, even without being spoken aloud. It did not need to be repeated in full. It only needed to be remembered in fragments. Fragments were enough, because fragments invite completion. And those who observed did not leave them incomplete. They filled the spaces quietly, drawing connections where none had been confirmed, aligning impressions until they began to feel consistent. A hesitation became a pattern. A shift in tone became a tendency. A single moment became something that seemed to extend beyond itself. No one declared it. They did not need to. They allowed it to settle. There is something particular about the way belief forms in silence. It does not require agreement. It does not require evidence. It only requires that enough people feel something similar, even if they cannot explain why. And once that shared feeling exists, it begins to guide attention. People begin to watch differently. Not more obviously, but more carefully. A longer look when she speaks. A quieter pause when she enters. A subtle expectation that something, however small, might reveal itself again. And in that expectation, the meaning of each moment begins to change. Her silence is no longer simply silence. It is measured. Her composure is no longer simply composure. It is observed. Even her stillness begins to carry weight, as though it is holding something beneath it that has not yet been seen, but might be. The court does not confront her. It adjusts around her, and that adjustment is difficult to detect at first, because it does not interrupt anything. It blends into the existing rhythm, altering it only slightly, enough that it feels natural rather than forced. But over time, the difference becomes clearer, not in what is said, but in what is assumed. Trust does not disappear in a single moment. It finds, quietly, without declaration. It moves from certainty into something less defined, something that no longer holds as firmly as it once did. And once that movement begins, it does not easily return to where it started, because trust, once unsettled, does not require proof to remain uncertain. It requires only the possibility that something may not be as it appears. And that possibility, once introduced, does not leave. It lingers, attached to every glance, every pause, every moment that might be interpreted more than once. The wife remains unchanged in her actions. She speaks as she always has. She stands as she always has. She holds herself with the same care that has always defined her presence. But the space around her no longer receives those actions in the same way. Something has shifted, and it does not need to be named to be felt. No one spoke of it directly. Yet the way she was seen had already begun to change. And as those quiet observations gathered, without being questioned, they started to influence what others expected to notice next. Out of that subtle shift, what once appeared as composure was already beginning to be viewed through a far more uncertain lens. The court did not need new ideas to question her. It already had old ones. They had been there long before her presence, long before any moment that could be pointed to as the beginning of doubt. They lived quietly beneath conversation, beneath judgment, beneath the way women were expected to exist within a space that did not fully belong to them. No one needed to explain them. They were understood. A woman was expected to feel, but not too visibly. She was expected to care, but not too deeply. She was expected to remain affected, but never to the point where that effect could be seen as losing control. It was a narrow line, and it did not remain still, because the same emotion that could be read as devotion in one moment could be read as excess in another. The same attention that could be seen as loyalty could become suspicion when repeated too often. The same concern, when held too long, could begin to resemble something less acceptable, something less stable. These interpretations did not arrive with certainty. They shifted, and in that shifting, they became difficult to resist. A wife did not need to show jealousy to be suspected of it. She only needed to appear attentive in the wrong way. A glance that lingered, a question asked at the wrong moment, a silence that suggested more than it revealed. These could be gathered, aligned, and placed within a pattern that already existed in the minds of those observing her. A pattern they did not need to question, because it felt familiar. There is something quiet in the way expectation reshapes what is seen. It does not alter the action itself. It alters the meaning attached to it. A small gesture becomes something more. A neutral moment becomes charged with implication. And once that implication is accepted, it begins to define what follows. A woman who speaks is no longer simply speaking. She is reacting. A woman who pauses is no longer simply pausing. She is holding something back. A woman who remains silent is no longer simply composed. She is concealing. Each interpretation moves slightly further from the original action, but not so far that it feels disconnected. The distance is gradual, almost unnoticeable. And because of that, it feels natural. It feels correct. The mistress does not introduce these ideas. She does not need to. She allows them to exist. She places moments in spaces where they can be seen, and then leaves them untouched. She does not guide the conclusion. She allows others to arrive at it on their own. And conclusions reached without pressure often feel more certain. They do not feel imposed. They feel discovered. The silence of the man plays its part as well. He does not deny. He does not confirm. He does not interrupt the quiet movement of these impressions as they begin to settle into something more solid. His stillness is not interpreted as neutrality. It is read as distance. And distance, in such a setting, does not remain without meaning. It suggests hesitation. Hesitation suggests doubt. And doubt, once associated with her, does not remain confined to him. It extends. Others notice it. Others interpret it. And soon, what began as a quiet absence of response becomes something that feels like confirmation. Not because it has been proven, but because it has not been challenged. There is a kind of quiet alignment that forms in this way. No single voice leads it. No single moment defines it. It gathers slowly, built from assumptions that already existed, reinforced by observations that seem to support them. And once it forms, it does not require reinforcement to remain. It sustains itself. The wife continues as she always has, measured, careful, attentive to every detail that might be seen. But the space around her no longer meets those efforts in the same way. Because now, there is something already waiting, a belief that does not need to be stated, an expectation that does not need to be justified. And once expectation exists, every action begins to move toward it. Nothing new had been introduced, yet what was already believed had begun to attach itself to her. And as those quiet assumptions found small moments to settle into, they started to feel less like possibilities and more like truth. Out of that familiar pattern, Even the most controlled reaction was already beginning to resemble something it had never been. It did not begin with separation. There was no clear moment when she was removed from those around her. No visible break in the relationships that had once held steady. The same people remained in their places. The same routines continued without interruption. The same words were exchanged in the same tones. And yet, something had begun to thin. Not in a distance that could be measured, but in something less visible. A hesitation where there had once been ease. A pause where there had once been certainty. A quiet awareness that did not need to be explained, but could be felt. The household did not turn against her. It adjusted around her. Servants, who once moved with familiarity in her presence, began to observe more carefully. Not openly, not with intention, but with the quiet caution that grows when something feels uncertain. Their responses remained respectful, their gestures unchanged, but something within them had shifted. They listened differently. A request that once felt simple now carried weight. A tone that once passed unnoticed now lingered slightly longer than it should have. Nothing was refused. Nothing was challenged. But nothing was entirely neutral anymore. And neutrality, once altered, does not easily return. The mistress did not need to speak to them directly. She did not need to instruct or persuade. She allowed small impressions to move through the spaces they occupied. A look was observed at the wrong moment. A reaction recalled in fragments. A silence that seemed to suggest more than it revealed. Servants are not outside the court. They exist within it. They carry what they see, what they hear, what they sense, but cannot fully define. And when something begins to feel uncertain, they do not resist it. They adjust, because adjustment is safer than certainty. The same quiet movement reached beyond the household. Among relatives, the shift was less visible, but no less present. Conversations remained polite. Invitations continued. Appearances were maintained in the way they always had been. But beneath that surface, something had begun to settle. A question that was not asked directly. A concern that was not spoken aloud. A hesitation that did not interrupt, but did not disappear either. No one declared a change. They did not need to. They began to watch, not with suspicion, but with awareness. A kind of attention that waits without announcing itself, that listens without interrupting, that gathers small details and allows them to form meaning over time. And meaning, once formed, does not remain isolated. It moves, from one conversation to another, from one impression to the next, until what was once uncertain begins to feel consistent. The wife does not hear this movement as it unfolds. She remains within the same spaces, surrounded by the same people, holding herself with the same care she has always maintained. Her words remain measured. Her presence remains composed, but something around her no longer responds in the same way. Support does not disappear. It recedes, not suddenly, not completely, but enough that it can no longer be relied upon without question. There is something quiet in the way isolation forms in such a place. It does not arrive through exclusion. It does not require confrontation. It builds through absence small, almost invisible reductions in certainty, in trust, in the ease that once existed without effort. And once that ease is gone, it does not return on its own, because what replaces it does not need to be defined. It only needs to remain. The wife does not stand alone, not visibly, but the space around her has begun to shift in a way that leaves her without something she once had. Not allies in name, but allies in certainty. And certainty, once removed, is not easily restored, because even those who remain close begin to hold a distance they cannot fully explain. They remain present, but not unchanged. Nothing was openly taken from her, yet the certainty that once surrounded her had begun to fade. And as that quiet hesitation moved through those closest to her, It altered how every word and gesture would be received. As that gradual distance settled, the support she once relied on was already becoming something far less certain. Nothing needed to be invented completely. It was enough that something remained unfinished. A detail shared without its context. A sentence repeated without its beginning. A fragment allowed to exist without the rest that would have made it clear. In the Tudor court, information did not move as a whole. It moved in pieces. And pieces, once separated, did not return to their original form. They travelled lightly, easily carried, easily remembered, and even more easily altered without anyone intending to alter them. The mistress did not need to lie. She only needed to leave something incomplete. A remark placed in passing, quiet enough not to seem intentional, but clear enough to be noticed. A mention of something that had happened, but not when, not how, not why. A suggestion that did not claim certainty, but did not deny it either. It settled in the air, and once settled, it invited attention. Those who heard it did not question it directly. They held it. They turned it over quietly, aligning it with what they had already begun to suspect, allowing it to connect with impressions that had not yet found form. And in that connection, it began to grow. A partial truth does not resist expansion. It encourages it, because what is missing invites completion, and those who complete it do so with what they already believe, not with what can be confirmed. In this way, the fragment becomes something larger than it ever was, something that feels whole. The mistress did not repeat herself. She did not reinforce what had been said. She allowed others to carry it, from one space to another, from one voice to the next, until the origin no longer mattered. What mattered was that it continued. There is something quiet in the way a secret can exist without ever being clearly revealed. It does not need to be spoken in full. It only needs to be suggested in a way that feels as though it should not have been heard. A lowered voice, a glance that follows the words, a pause that implies something more remains unsaid. These are enough, because what is withheld often carries more weight than what is given. The court does not demand clarity. It responds to implication. And implication, once introduced, does not remain still. It shifts. It attaches itself to the next observation, the next moment, the next reaction that can be aligned with it. Each time it does, it becomes less uncertain, less questionable, until it begins to feel familiar. The wife does not hear this information in its original form. By the time it reaches her, it has already changed. The edges have been smoothed, the gaps filled, the uncertainty reduced. It no longer appears incomplete. It appears suggestive. And suggestion is difficult to confront, because it does not exist in a way that can be denied. She cannot correct what has not been clearly stated. She cannot challenge what has not been openly claimed. She is left with something that feels directed at her, but cannot be addressed directly. And in that space, reaction becomes possible. Not intentional, not planned, but inevitable. A question asked too sharply, a denial that arrives too quickly, a tone that carries more urgency than the moment seems to require. It is small, but it is seen, and once seen, it does not remain attached to the uncertainty that caused it. It becomes something else, a confirmation, not of the content itself, but of the reaction it produced. And in a place where reactions are often taken as signs of what lies beneath, that is enough. The mistress does not respond. She does not clarify what she has said, nor does she deny it. She allows the moment to settle exactly as it is, leaving the interpretation entirely in the hands of those who observed it. And they do not leave it alone. They connect it to what they have heard before, to what they have seen before, to what they are now prepared to believe. And once belief begins to take shape, it does not return to uncertainty easily. Nothing she introduced was complete. Yet what remained unfinished began to feel more convincing as it moved. And when the reaction finally appeared, it no longer pointed back to the uncertainty that created it. With that shift taking hold, what could not be proven had already begun to resemble something that did not need to be. There was no longer a correct way to respond. What once felt like a choice, whether to speak or remain silent, whether to react or to hold still, had begun to narrow into something else. Each option remained visible, but none of them led back to safety. The space around her had changed, not in its structure, not in its rhythm, but in how it received what she did. The same gestures, the same pauses, the same careful restraint she had always maintained no longer settled in the same way. They lingered, not as actions, as meanings, silence, which had once protected her, no longer carried the same weight. It no longer suggested composure or control. It was observed differently now, held longer, examined more closely, placed beside what others had already begun to suspect. A silence that stretched just slightly too far could become distance. Distance could become indifference. Indifference could begin to resemble something colder. And once that resemblance appeared, it did not need to be confirmed. It remained. Speaking did not resolve it. Words, once offered, did not return clarity. They moved into the same space of interpretation, shaped by expectation rather than intention. A measured response could be read as controlled. A controlled tone could be read as strained. Strain, once noticed, did not remain contained. It expanded. A firm voice could be remembered as sharp. Sharpness could be remembered as agitation. Agitation could be aligned with everything that had already begun to gather around her. There was no moment when she could step outside of this pattern. Each reaction, no matter how carefully placed, entered a space where it did not remain neutral. It was received, adjusted, and returned with a meaning that no longer belonged to her. There is something quiet in the way this shift settles. It does not force itself. It surrounds. The court does not reject her. It observes her differently, more closely, more deliberately, not in a way that can be resisted, because there is nothing direct to oppose, no accusation to deny, no claim to correct, only a series of interpretations that do not need to be spoken to exist. And because they are not spoken, they cannot be undone. She becomes aware of it gradually, not through confrontation, but through the absence of ease, through the way conversations pause in unfamiliar places, through the way responses arrive slightly delayed, slightly measured, as though something is being considered that was never considered before. Her presence has not changed, but its effect has. Each moment now carries an expectation that was not there before, an expectation that something, however small, might reveal itself again. And once expectation takes hold, it does not wait for certainty. It fills the space before certainty can arrive. The wife adjusts. She speaks less. She watches more. She holds herself tighter within the boundaries she believes will protect her. But those boundaries no longer function in the same way, because what surrounds her is no longer neutral. It is interpretive. A still expression is no longer simply still. It is guarded. A lowered voice is no longer simply quiet. It is restrained. Even composure begins to feel deliberate, as though it is covering something rather than existing on its own. There is no clear point where this begins, no single moment where everything changes. It settles slowly, until it becomes difficult to remember what came before. And once it settles, it does not require reinforcement. It sustains itself, because every reaction, no matter how small, no matter how controlled, now enters a space where it will not be received as it is. It will be received as something else. There was no longer a response that could return her to safety. Only choices that led to different forms of misinterpretation. and as each reaction passed through the same quiet filter of expectation, it began to confirm what had never been clearly proven, with no path left untouched by interpretation. Even her restraint had already begun to resemble something it was never meant to be. He was not confronted. No one approached him with certainty. No one placed a clear accusation before him that demanded an answer. The court did not move in that way. It did not force decisions into the open. It allowed them to form quietly, over time, shaped by what was seen, what was suggested, and what was left unsaid. He remained where he had always been, at the center, and yet, what reached him no longer arrived unchanged. It came in fragments, a remark that seemed casual, spoken without emphasis, but placed carefully enough to remain, a tone that suggested concern rather than judgment, a pause that allowed the idea to settle without being pressed. They did not tell him anything directly. They allowed him to notice. A word about strain, a mention of tension, a quiet observation that something felt different. None of it required confirmation. It did not need to be proven, because it did not arrive as a claim. It arrived as a possibility, and possibility, once introduced, does not remain still. It moves through memory, attaching itself to moments that might otherwise have passed unnoticed. A glance he had not considered before, a silence that had not seemed significant, a reaction that had felt brief, but now appeared to linger longer than it should have. He did not resist it. There was nothing to resist, because nothing had been clearly stated. There is something subtle in the way suggestion takes hold when it is not presented as certainty. It does not demand acceptance. It invites recognition. It allows the listener to arrive at the conclusion on his own. And once he does, it feels less like influence and more like realization. He begins to recall, not everything, only what aligns, a moment where her voice had tightened, a pause that had felt slightly too long, a look that had not fully settled before it passed. These were small, but they did not remain small. They gathered, not as proof, as an impression. And impression, once formed, does not require completeness. It requires consistency. The mistress does not speak against the wife. She does not need to. She speaks around her. A comparison that does not appear as a comparison. A presence that does not seem to compete, but does not withdraw either. A calm that exists without effort, or at least appears to. She does not present herself as better. She allows the difference to be noticed. And difference, once seen, invites judgment, not immediately, but gradually. The husband does not declare a change. He does not remove himself. He does not speak of doubt. But something within his attention shifts. He listens differently. He watches more closely. He becomes aware of moments he had not marked before. And once aware, he does not easily return to unawareness. There is a quiet weight in this shift, not heavy enough to break anything, but enough to alter the balance. A home does not need to fracture to feel less steady. It only needs to lose a sense of ease. And ease, once disturbed, does not restore itself without effort. He begins to seek something else, not openly, not with intention, but with the quiet instinct to move toward what feels calmer, more stable, less demanding of interpretation. It is not a decision. It is a drift. The mistress remains composed, unchanged, unaffected by the tension that now seems to gather in the presence of the wife. She does not respond to it. She does not acknowledge it. She exists beside it, without appearing to carry it. And that absence becomes noticeable, because where tension is expected, its absence stands out. He does not name it, but he feels it. A difference between what requires attention and what does not. A difference between what feels uncertain and what feels still. These differences do not need to be explained. They begin to guide him. Quietly, without declaration, the wife remains as she has always been. Measured, composed, careful in every detail. But now, her composure is no longer received as it once was. It is observed, compared, placed beside something else that appears easier, lighter, less affected by the weight of expectation. And once comparison begins, it does not remain equal, not because one has changed, but because one is now seen differently. There is something final in the way perception shifts within a single person. It does not need to be shared immediately. It does not need to be spoken to exist. It settles, and once settled, it begins to influence everything that follows. He was not told what to believe, yet what reached him began to guide how he remembered and what he noticed. And as those impressions aligned without needing to be confirmed, they quietly altered where his attention chose to rest. That quiet shift settled into place, leaving the difference between the two women already feeling more certain than it truly was. It did not arrive as a statement. No one declared that something was wrong with her. No one used words that could be repeated without consequence. The court did not move with certainty when it came to matters that could not be easily proven. It moved through suggestion, a quiet remark, placed carefully within conversation, not strong enough to stand on its own, but clear enough to remain once heard, a tone that did not accuse, but did not dismiss either, a pause that allowed the idea to linger without being pressed into form. Nothing was confirmed, but something had been introduced. It did not appear as a claim. It appeared as a concern. There is a difference between questioning someone and worrying about them. One invites defense. The other invites silence. And silence, in such a place, often carries more weight than denial. The mistress did not speak directly. She did not need to. A mention of fatigue, a suggestion of strain, a quiet observation that something seemed unsettled. These were not accusations. They were possibilities. And possibilities, once placed in the right setting, do not remain small. They attach themselves to memory, to observation, to every moment that could be made to align with them. A pause in conversation becomes hesitation. Hesitation becomes uncertainty. Uncertainty begins to resemble something deeper, something less visible, something that does not need to be seen clearly to be believed. The court does not require proof for what it already expects to find. It requires alignment. And once a possibility aligns with even a few small observations, it begins to feel less like speculation and more like recognition. A recognition that no one claims to have made. But many begin to share. The suggestion deepens. Not through repetition, but through variation. It does not return in the same words. It shifts. A reference to rest, a mention of stress, a quiet recollection of how such things have appeared before, in other families, in other women, in other situations that no one names directly, but everyone understands. History does not need to be detailed. It only needs to be implied. A lineage of fragility, a pattern that may not exist, but feels familiar enough to be accepted. A past that cannot be confirmed, but cannot be fully dismissed either. These ideas do not demand belief. They invite it. And once belief begins to form in this way, it does not require reinforcement to remain. The husband hears it, not as an accusation, as a concern that feels measured, thoughtful, reasonable, something that does not ask him to act immediately, but encourages him to notice. And noticing, once encouraged, does not stop. He begins to look more closely, not with suspicion, but with attention. A detail he had not marked before now feels relevant. A reaction he had once dismissed now feels connected to something else. A moment that had passed without meaning now seems to carry it. He does not declare it. He does not confront her. But the way he observes has changed. And once observation changes, Perception follows. The wife does not hear these suggestions in their original form. They reach her altered, softened in language, but sharpened in implication. No one speaks of illness. No one names instability. But the space around her begins to hold the possibility that something beneath her composure may not be as steady as it appears. And possibility, once introduced, does not remain contained. It spreads, quietly, attached to every silence, every pause. Every moment could be interpreted more than once. She continues, as she always has, measured, controlled, careful not to allow anything to surface that could be taken out of its place. But now, even restraint begins to feel different. It is no longer simply composure. It is watched, and what is watched is rarely left without meaning. There is something fragile in the way such an idea settles. It does not need to be true. It does not need to be complete. It only needs to remain possible. Because once something becomes possible in the eyes of others, it begins to shape what they are prepared to see. And what they are prepared to see does not easily return to neutrality. Nothing was stated clearly. Yet the idea of something beneath her composure had already begun to take form. And as quiet concern replaced certainty, every detail started to be viewed as part of something larger than itself. The possibility settled into place, leaving even her calmness beginning to feel less like strength and more like something being carefully held together. It did not appear all at once. There was no single account that could be pointed to. No record that stood complete on its own. What formed around her did not begin as a story. It began as fragments. A reaction remembered. A tone recalled. A moment described without its full context. Each piece was small, too small to define anything by itself. But they did not remain separate. They were held, not formally, not in writing, but in memory. In the quiet way, people carry details that seem insignificant at first, only to return to them later when something begins to feel connected. And once the connection begins, separation becomes difficult. A raised voice, once recalled, does not remain attached to its moment. It becomes available to be placed beside another memory, another reaction, another pause that had once seemed unrelated. Placed together, they begin to suggest something more, not through certainty, through repetition, the same moment, told again, not the same way, adjusted slightly, shortened, clarified in ways that remove hesitation and replace it with confidence. Each retelling feels closer to something complete, closer to something understood. There is something quiet in the way repetition changes what is remembered. It does not add new information. It removes uncertainty. It smooths the edges, fills the gaps, and aligns the details until they begin to resemble something consistent. And consistency, once perceived, carries weight. A single reaction can be dismissed. 2 can be reconsidered. 3 begin to feel intentional, not because they are, but because they appear that way once placed together. The court does not record these moments in any official sense. It does not need to. It holds them collectively. Each person carries a version, and though no version is identical, they are similar enough to reinforce one another. The differences do not weaken the impression. They strengthen it, because variation suggests independence, and independence suggests truth. The mistress does not control these retellings. She does not need to. She allows them to exist, to move, to settle where they will. She does not correct what is said, even when it shifts beyond its original form. She does not interrupt the pattern once it begins, because an interruption would draw attention, and attention, when directed toward the source, disrupts the movement. She remains outside it, still, composed, unchanged in a way that does not invite inclusion. The focus does not return to her. It gathers elsewhere, Around the one who has been observed, the wife continues, as she always has. Measured, careful, aware of the need to maintain control in every visible detail. But what surrounds her is no longer a collection of separate moments. It has begun to resemble something else. A pattern, not one that has been proven, but one that feels recognized. And recognition, once formed, does not require confirmation. It requires only continuity. Each new moment is no longer received on its own. It is placed within what has already been established. It is compared, aligned, and adjusted until it fits. Even when it does not fully match, it is made to resemble what has come before. Because what is expected tends to be seen, and what is seen tends to be remembered. There is something quiet in the way an image forms from repetition. It does not need to be declared. It does not need to be agreed upon. It settles gradually until it becomes difficult to separate what was originally observed from what has been constructed around it. The wife does not hear this image as it forms. She does not see the way each moment is carried, repeated, and returned to her in altered form. She remains within the same structure, responding as she believes she must, holding herself steady against what she cannot fully perceive. But what has formed around her no longer depends on what she does. It depends on what has already been remembered. And once memory begins to align in this way, it does not easily return to uncertainty. Each moment remained small on its own. Yet repetition allowed them to gather into something that felt continuous. And as those fragments were recalled with increasing certainty, they began to resemble a pattern that no longer required explanation. An image had already begun to hold, leaving even her most controlled reactions quietly absorbed into something that no longer belonged to them. No one could point to where it truly began. There was no single version that could be traced back to its source. No original account that remained untouched by retelling. What existed now was not a story in its first form. It was something that had already passed through many voices. Each telling did not add much. It removed. Uncertainty faded first. Then hesitation. Then the quiet gaps where doubt might have remained. What was left behind felt cleaner, easier to understand, easier to accept. There is something gradual in the way repetition changes what is believed. It does not force agreement. It creates familiarity. And familiarity, once settled, does not feel like something that needs to be questioned. It feels known. A moment that had once seemed unclear now appears defined. A reaction that had once been brief now feels extended. A detail that had once been uncertain now fits into place without resistance. Not because it was always that way, but because it has been heard that way, often enough. Each time the story is told, it moves slightly further from its beginning. It becomes smoother, more consistent, and less burdened by the parts that do not align easily. And those parts do not disappear. They are simply left behind. What remains is something that feels complete, something that does not invite correction. The court does not ask where it came from. It does not need to, because once something has been repeated enough times, it no longer feels like something that requires a source. It feels like something that has always been there. An understanding, a quiet agreement, a shared sense that what is being said fits. There is a moment, difficult to identify, impossible to mark, when a story no longer feels like a story. It feels like the truth, not proven, but accepted. And once accepted, it begins to guide perception. People no longer wait to observe. They expect to confirm. Each new moment is not received on its own. It is placed within what has already been accepted. It is shaped to fit what is already believed, even when it does not fully match. The difference is not resisted. It is adjusted, because expectation, once established, does not remain passive. It directs attention. It filters what is seen. It determines what is remembered. The wife continues as she always has. measured, careful, holding each reaction within the boundaries she believes will protect her. But those boundaries no longer function in the same way, because what surrounds her is no longer uncertain. It is defined, not by what she has done, but by what has been said often enough to feel real. There is something quiet in the way a reputation changes colour. It does not shift suddenly. It darkens slowly. As each new layer settles over what came before, the original form does not vanish. It becomes harder to see. Each retelling adds weight. Each repetition deepens the impression, until what remains is no longer balanced. Not because it was replaced, but because it has been covered. And once covered, it is not easily uncovered again. The court does not declare this change. It does not need to. It reflects it in how she is received, in how she is remembered, in how even her silence begins to carry meaning it never held before. What began as fragments has become something whole, not because it was ever complete, but because it has been told enough times to appear that way. What was once uncertain had been repeated until it no longer felt incomplete. And as familiarity replaced doubt, no one remained interested in where it had begun. What settled in its place already carried the weight of truth, even if it had never fully belonged to it. Nothing in the court moved quickly. Pressure did not arrive as a single force. It did not press forward all at once, demanding a reaction that was both clear and easily remembered. It gathered slowly, almost gently, settling into the spaces between moments until it became difficult to notice where it had begun. And once it settled, it did not leave. The wife continued, as she always had. Measured, controlled, careful not to allow anything to extend beyond what could be held in place. But something within that control had begun to change. Not in how she appeared. How much does it require? There is a difference between holding oneself steady and holding oneself together. The first feels natural. The second demands attention. And attention, when sustained for too long, begins to turn inward. She watches herself. Before speaking, before reacting, before allowing even the smallest shift to reach her face. Each moment is considered, not because it must be, but because it feels as though it should be. This is how the tension remains. Not visible, but present. A constant awareness that does not fade, that does not rest, that does not allow her to return to the ease she once carried without effort. She begins to question, not what others have said, what she has done. A pause that felt natural begins to feel deliberate. A tone that once seemed steady now feels uncertain. A reaction that passed without meaning now returns in memory, examined more closely than before. She does not find anything clear, but she does find nothing either. And in that space between certainty and doubt, something begins to form. A quiet uncertainty, not strong enough to define itself, but persistent enough to remain. The mistress does not increase her actions. She does not need to. She allows the environment to do the work. Moments continue as they have. Small, contained, easily dismissed on their own. But now, they do not pass as they once did. They accumulate, because the wife no longer receives them without awareness. She feels them, not as events, as pressure, a presence that lingers after the moment has ended, a sense that something has occurred, even if it cannot be clearly named, a tension that does not release fully, even when nothing visible remains. It builds, quietly, without interruption, and what builds without interruption does not require intensity to become overwhelming. It requires time. Time allows repetition. Repetition allows weight. And weight, once carried long enough, begins to alter how even the smallest movement is felt. Her reactions begin to shift. Not suddenly, but gradually. A shorter pause where there was once stillness. A sharper tone where there was once neutrality. A glance that lingers just slightly longer than she intends. Each change is small, almost imperceptible, but in a space where everything is observed, even the smallest shift does not remain alone. It is noticed, placed beside what came before, aligned with what has already begun to form around her. And in that alignment, it appears to confirm something, not because it does, but because it fits. There is something quiet in the way exhaustion reshapes control. It does not remove it. It tightens until the effort required to maintain it becomes evident in ways that cannot be fully concealed. The more she tries to remain unchanged, the more visible the effort becomes. And effort, once seen, does not remain neutral. It suggests strain. Strain suggests instability, not directly, but gradually. The husband notices, not with certainty, but with attention, a difference that cannot be clearly explained, but can no longer be ignored. A sense that something is no longer as it once was. Even if nothing has been openly declared, he does not confront it. He observes it, and observation, once sustained, does not return to absence. The wife feels it, not in words, in presence, in the way silence settles differently, in the way moments linger longer than they should, in the way her own reactions return to her, repeated in memory, questioned without resolution. She begins to anticipate, not events, her own responses, and anticipation does not ease tension. It extends it, because what is expected does not arrive alone. It brings the weight of what has already been felt. The next moment is not new. It carries the last one with it, and the one before that, until reaction is no longer a response to what is happening. It becomes a release of what has been building. And release, once it occurs, does not appear isolated. It appears accumulated. Nothing forced her to change. Yet the constant pressure began to alter how she felt and how she responded. And as each small shift settled beside what had come before, it started to resemble something that no longer belonged to a single moment. What finally surfaced did not appear as exhaustion, but as confirmation of what others had already begun to believe. There is no clear moment when the focus turns. No signal marks the shift. No voice declares that what mattered before no longer holds the same weight. The same conversations continue. The same rooms remain filled with familiar presence. The same patterns repeat themselves without interruption. And yet, attention has begun to move. Not away, but elsewhere. What once might have been held as a question of loyalty does not remain there. It does not stay attached to actions that could be traced back, examined, or compared. It does not return to the origin that unsettled the balance between them. It drifts, quietly, almost without resistance. There is something subtle in the way a situation can be reframed without appearing to change at all. The subject remains. The people involved remain. But the center, what is noticed, what is discussed, what is remembered, no longer rests in the same place. A glance is no longer tied to what caused it. It is tied to how it appeared. Attention is no longer linked to its origin. It is linked to the one who seems to carry it. In this way, the meaning of what has happened begins to settle differently, not on the act. On the reaction, the mistress does not argue. She does not defend what cannot be openly addressed. She does not return to what cannot be spoken without consequence. She allows the silence around it to remain, undisturbed, unchallenged, because silence, in this case, does not erase. It redirects. The court does not speak of betrayal. It does not linger on what would require clarity. Instead, it observes what can be seen, a tone that seems altered, a presence that feels heavier, a composure that appears maintained rather than natural. These are easier to hold, easier to repeat, easier to place into conversation without needing to explain where they came from. A moral question requires resolution. A question of temperament does not. It only requires recognition. And once recognition begins, it does not demand proof. It invites agreement. A remark that something feels unsettled. A quiet suggestion that tension follows her presence. A passing observation that what was once steady now seems strained. No one states it directly. They do not need to, because what is implied often travels further than what is declared, and what travels further settles deeper. The husband does not return to the beginning. He does not examine the cause. He observes what is now visible, not as a judgment, as a response to what appears in front of him, shaped not by what happened, but by how it now presents itself. The accumulation of small impressions, repeated often enough to feel consistent, begins to guide his attention. He does not choose to shift. He follows what has already shifted, and what has shifted no longer points toward him. It rests elsewhere. The wife continues as she has always been, careful, measured, attentive to every detail that might be seen. But what she maintains is no longer received as it once was. It is no longer taken as stable. It is examined as an effort. And effort, once visible, does not remain neutral. It suggests strain. Strain suggests imbalance. Imbalance begins to resemble something that can be spoken of without being fully named. There is no declaration that she has become the issue, but the way she is received begins to change. Not in direct rejection. In adjustment, conversations move slightly differently around her. Responses arrive with a fraction more distance. Attention lingers in places where it once passed without pause. She is not excluded. She is considered, and consideration, in this form, does not feel like inclusion. It feels like awareness. A careful awareness that alters the space without interrupting it. In this way, she does not lose her place. She shifts within it, from presence to condition, from participant to something that influences the atmosphere simply by existing within it. The situation no longer belongs to two people. It narrows, not through decision, through perception, because once attention has settled in a new place, it does not return easily to where it began. It continues, quietly, consistently, until what once required explanation no longer does, until what once belonged to a shared moment now feels as though it has always belonged to her. Attention had already begun to move, leaving its original focus behind without needing to be questioned. And as visible reactions replaced their original cause, the meaning of the situation quietly began to change. A shared situation was already beginning to narrow into something that appeared to belong only to her. No decree announces the change. No document is placed before witnesses. No formal judgment is delivered in a voice that carries across the hall. The structure of the court remains intact. The positions unchanged. The order preserved in appearance. And yet, something has already shifted enough to allow a different outcome. What once required proof no longer does. What once demanded justification now rests on something less visible, but no less effective. A pattern that has been accepted. An impression that has settled. A perception that no longer feels uncertain. These are not written, but they function. Because once a belief begins to feel consistent, it does not need to be confirmed again. It becomes a reference point, something others return to when deciding how to act, how to respond, how to place someone within the structure that surrounds them. The wife is not removed. She remains. Her name is unchanged. Her position is still recognized. Her presence continues to exist within the same walls, under the same expectations that once defined her place. But the meaning of that place has altered. There is something quiet in the way separation begins when it is not declared. It does not arrive through distance that can be measured. It does not require physical absence. It begins through adjustment, a seat placed slightly further away, a conversation that no longer includes her at the same time, a decision made without her presence, though she remains within reach. None of these actions stand out on their own. They do not appear as an exclusion. They appear as a necessity, a subtle recognition that something has changed, even if it has not been named. And once that recognition is accepted, it begins to guide behavior. The court does not speak of limitation. It practices it. Her influence does not disappear. It narrows. Not abruptly, not in a way that invites resistance, but gradually, until the space she once occupied fully begins to contract. Her voice carries less weight, not because it has changed, but because it is received differently. Her presence alters fewer outcomes, not because she has withdrawn, but because she is no longer placed at the center of decisions. This shift does not need explanation. It has already been justified, not through law, through perception, a perception that suggests caution, that suggests awareness, that suggests the need to maintain balance by adjusting where influence is allowed to settle. The husband does not declare this change. He moves within it. He begins to make decisions in spaces where she is not present. He allows distance to form, not as rejection, but as a response to what now feels necessary, a way to preserve what remains stable by limiting what appears uncertain. It is not spoken as avoidance. It is felt as protection. And protection, once accepted as reasonable, does not invite challenge. The wife remains composed. She continues to hold herself within the boundaries that have always defined her. She does not step outside them. She does not attempt to force what has shifted back into place, because nothing has been taken in a way that can be named. And what cannot be named cannot be reclaimed directly. There is something final in the way distance becomes acceptable. It does not require agreement. It does not require acknowledgement. It simply begins to feel appropriate. A different arrangement, a quieter presence, a space that no longer demands the same level of attention. These changes do not appear severe. They appear reasonable. And reason, once aligned with perception, does not require further support. The court continues, uninterrupted. Its structure remains visible. Its order preserved. Its rhythm unchanged to those who do not look closely. But within that rhythm, something has been altered. Not the form. The function. The wife is still there, but she no longer occupies the same place in how decisions move, how influence settles, how attention is distributed. And that difference does not need to be declared to exist. It is practiced, quietly, consistently, until it no longer feels like a change. It feels like how things have always been. Nothing was formally decided, yet the structure had already begun to adjust around what was now accepted. And as those adjustments repeated without interruption, they created a distance that no longer needed to be explained. A separation had already taken form, appearing not as loss, but as something that simply felt appropriate. She is still there. Nothing in the structure has been removed. No announcement has been made. No position taken from her. No formal step that would suggest a change large enough to be named. The marriage remains intact, visible in the same gestures, the same appearances, the same quiet confirmations that nothing has been broken. And yet, something no longer holds. She continues to stand beside him. She continues to appear where she is expected to appear. She continues to move within the same rooms, surrounded by the same walls, the same people, the same patterns that once defined her place. But the way she is received has altered. Not openly, not in a way that can be challenged, but enough. There is something quiet in the difference between presence and position. One can remain unchanged while the other shifts almost entirely. A woman may still be seen, still be acknowledged, to still be included in the structure that surrounds her, and yet it no longer carries the same weight within it. Her words are heard, but not held. They pass through the room without settling in the same way. They do not linger. They do not return in later conversations as they once did. They exist in the moment and then disappear. Not dismissed, but not retained. There is no refusal, only absence. Her presence is not rejected, but it is no longer relied upon. This difference does not require explanation. It forms quietly, through the accumulation of what has already been accepted, a pattern that has settled, an impression that no longer feels uncertain, a belief that has been repeated enough times to become something that does not need to be questioned. Trust does not disappear suddenly. It thins, not visibly, but steadily. Each moment carries slightly less certainty than before. Each interaction holds a trace of hesitation that was not there once. Each response arrives with a quiet awareness that something has shifted, even if no one can point to when it began. And over time, that hesitation becomes constant. She speaks. Others listen. But what is heard is no longer received as it once was. There is something held back, not in what she says, in how it is taken. Because once doubt has been introduced, it does not remain contained. It extends into every pause. Every silence, every moment could be interpreted more than once. Her composure remains, but it is no longer accepted without question. It is observed, measured, placed beside what has already been remembered. And once placed there, it does not stand alone. There is something fragile in the way trust is replaced by caution. It does not announce itself. It does not declare that belief has been lost. It simply begins to require confirmation. Each word must be weighed. Each reaction must be considered. Each presence must be accounted for. And in that process, something essential is gone. Not her place, not her name, not her position, but the ease that once allowed her to exist within all of those without resistance. She is not excluded. She is managed, carefully, quietly, without confrontation. There is no accusation that she can deny, no claim she can correct, only a shift that has already settled into how she is perceived. And perception, once altered in this way, does not return to neutrality easily. The husband does not remove her. He remains. He appears beside her when required, speaks to her when expected, and maintains the structure that the court continues to recognize. But something within his attention has changed. He no longer relies on her in the same way. He no longer responds to her presence with the same certainty, not because he has been told to, but because what he has observed no longer allows it. There is something final in this kind of loss, not because it is complete, but because it is quiet. It does not need to be confirmed to exist. It is felt in how she is received, in how she is remembered, in how even her silence no longer carries the same meaning it once did. She remains within the marriage, but she no longer defines it. She had not been removed, yet the meaning of her place had already begun to change. And as trust quietly gave way to caution, every word she spoke carried less weight than before. What once anchored the structure now lingered within it, no longer certain in how it would be received. No one removes her from the room. She remains where she has always been, within the same walls, among the same people, carrying the same name that once secured her place. Nothing in her position has been formally taken. Nothing in her role has been publicly altered. And yet, something within her begins to withdraw. Not in movement, in certainty. There is a difference between being surrounded and being held. The court remains full. The household remains occupied. The rhythms of daily life continue without interruption. Voices pass through the same corridors. Footsteps echo against the same stone floors. Gestures repeat themselves with practiced familiarity. But something no longer reaches her in the same way. A conversation ends without drawing her in. A glance passes without settling. A moment that once invited her presence now closes without it. These are small, too small to name, But they do not remain isolated. They gather, not around her. Within her, there is a quiet loneliness that does not require absence. It does not depend on distance. It forms when presence no longer carries recognition in the way it once did, when being seen no longer feels the same as being understood. She is not excluded. She is no longer included in the same way. And that difference does not need to be explained to be felt. She continues to move as she always has, measured, controlled, attentive to every detail that might be observed. But now, each movement returns to her differently, not as confirmation, as a question. A word spoken begins to linger in her own memory. A tone she once trusted now feels uncertain when recalled. A pause she did not notice before now reappears, examined more closely than it was ever meant to be. She begins to look back, not at what others have said, at what she might have done. There is something quiet in the way doubt turns inward. It does not arrive fully formed. It does not declare itself as disbelief. It begins as hesitation, a small uncertainty, then another, then a pattern that is not clear, but no longer feels random. She searches for the cause, not in others, in herself. A reaction that once passed without weight now feels excessive. A moment that once felt contained now appears extended when remembered. Even her composure, once held as certainty, begins to feel like something that might not have been as steady as she believed. She does not find answers, only more to examine. And examination, once continuous, does not lead to clarity. It leads to distance, not from others, from herself. There is something fragile in the way self-trust fades. It does not break. It loosens, gradually, almost gently, until the ground beneath each decision no longer feels entirely secure. She speaks more carefully, not because she must, because she is unsure. She pauses longer, not to maintain composure, to prevent what she cannot fully predict. Each moment becomes something to manage, not outwardly, internally. And what is managed internally does not disappear. It accumulates, a tension that does not release, a pressure that does not resolve, a constant awareness that does not allow rest. The court does not see this. It sees only what appears, and what appears remains composed. But composure, when sustained under this weight, does not feel like strength. It feels like an effort, and effort, when carried without relief, begins to change what it supports. There is something quiet in the loss that follows, not visible, not declared, but present. Her influence does not vanish. It weakens, not in position. In effect, words that once guided now pass without altering anything. The presence that once shaped decisions now exists beside them without entering. The tension that once settled around her now moves elsewhere without resistance. She does not resist this. Not openly, because there is nothing she can confront, nothing she can name, only a shift that has already taken place. And within that shift, something she once held without effort has begun to slip. Not authority, not status, something less visible, something that existed in how she was received, something that does not return once it is lost. She remains, but she no longer feels the same within what surrounds her. Nothing was taken from her directly, yet something within her had already begun to give way. And as doubt turned inward, each moment she once trusted began to feel uncertain in ways she could not fully explain. Something she once relied on quietly had already begun to fade, leaving her present, but no longer steady in how she was received. She appears unchanged. Nothing in her posture reveals strain. Nothing in her voice suggests urgency. She continues to move through the same rooms with the same measured calm, her presence fitting neatly into the spaces where it has already been accepted. And yet, what surrounds her is no longer entirely stable. There is something quiet in the way success carries its own weight. It does not arrive with certainty. It settles gradually. And once it settles, it must be maintained. Not openly, carefully, because what has been built without declaration cannot withstand direct exposure. The mistress does not speak of what she has done. She cannot. To explain is to reveal. To reveal is to invite examination. And examination, in such a place, does not remain contained once it begins. So she remains silent. Not because she has nothing to say, because silence protects what cannot be defended. There is a difference between influence that is seen and influence that is suspected. The first can be challenged. The second must remain uncertain to remain effective. And uncertainty, once disturbed, does not easily return to its original form. If a moment is noticed too clearly, it changes. If a pattern is named, it loses its ambiguity. If intention is suspected, it no longer appears natural. This is where risk begins. Not in action. In recognition, the court does not move quickly, but it does not remain still. It observes, quietly, without interruption, and what it observes does not always remain aligned. Some do not accept what has settled. Those who recall differently, those who notice inconsistencies where others have found confirmation. Their voices are not loud, but they exist, and existence, even in quiet form, introduces possibility of doubt, possibility of reversal, the possibility that what has been accepted may not remain so. The mistress cannot control this. She cannot prevent others from looking again, from remembering differently, from placing new meaning onto moments that had already been shaped into something else. She can only remain as she has been, composed, measured, unchanged in a way that does not invite further attention. But even stillness can be questioned. A calm that appears too consistent may begin to feel deliberate. A presence that never shifts may begin to seem practiced. And what appears practiced does not remain natural once it is noticed. There is something fragile in this balance. Too much movement invites suspicion. Too little invites the same. The space between them is narrow, and it does not remain fixed. The wife, too, does not remain unchanged. If she holds her composure, truly holds it, without interruption, without the visible strain that has been expected of her, the pattern begins to weaken. Not immediately, not completely, but enough to introduce something that has not been present before. Uncertainty, a reaction that does not come when it is anticipated, disrupts expectation. A moment that does not align with what has been accepted forces attention to adjust. And attention, once forced to adjust, does not return to certainty easily. The mistress cannot respond to this directly. To react would expose. To remain still may no longer be enough. There is something quiet in the way power depends on continuation. It does not exist in a single moment. It requires repetition, alignment, and reinforcement that appear natural enough to pass without question. But when repetition breaks, even slightly, what has been built begins to shift, not collapse. Shift. And in that shift, new interpretations begin to form. The court does not commit to one version permanently. It moves, slowly, carefully, following what appears most consistent, most stable, and most aligned with what it is prepared to accept. And if that alignment changes, so does everything attached to it. The mistress remains where she is. But what supports her position is no longer entirely certain. Not because it has been challenged directly, because it has become visible enough to be questioned. And once something is questioned, it does not return to invisibility. There is no moment where she is exposed, no point where everything turns at once. Only a quiet shift, a hesitation where there was once ease, a glance that lingers slightly longer than before, a sense that what was once accepted without question now requires something more, something clearer, something that cannot be easily provided. And in that absence, risk remains. Not fully formed, but present. Nothing around her had openly changed. Yet what supported her position had already begun to feel less certain. And as even the smallest inconsistency appeared, the pattern that once seemed stable began to invite attention again. Something that had remained unseen long enough to feel natural was already beginning to move closer to being noticed. There was never a weapon, no blade drawn in anger, no command spoken with force, no moment that could be pointed to as the beginning of violence, nothing that left a mark visible enough to be named, nothing that demanded witnesses, nothing that required explanation. And yet, something had been undone. It did not happen all at once. It did not arrive in a way that could be resisted. It formed quietly, through moments that seemed too small to matter, through reactions that did not remain where they belonged, through impressions that were carried, repeated, and allowed to settle until they no longer felt uncertain. Something is unsettling in the way a life can be altered without a single decisive act. No accusation was proven, no judgment was declared, no punishment was delivered, and still, the outcome remained. A presence that once carried weight became something that no longer held the same ground. A voice that once shaped what followed began to pass without leaving a trace. A place that once felt certain began to feel conditional, dependent on how it was received rather than what it was. Nothing had been taken, and yet everything had shifted. The court remained as it always had, ordered, measured, unchanged in its appearance. But within that order, meaning had moved, not in form, in perception. There is something quiet in the way perception defines reality when it is repeated often enough. It does not need to be accurate. It does not need to be complete. It only needs to feel consistent. And once it feels consistent, it becomes difficult to see beyond it. A woman may remain composed, yet be seen as strained. She may remain controlled, yet be remembered as unstable. She may remain present, yet no longer be received in the same way. These differences are not visible in her actions. They exist in how those actions are interpreted. And interpretation, once aligned across enough voices, does not require confirmation. It sustains itself. The trap was never built to be seen. It did not rely on confrontation, because confrontation can be resisted. It did not rely on force, because force can be opposed. It did not rely on proof, because proof can be questioned. It relied on something quieter. Expectation. Expectation shapes what is noticed. What is noticed shapes what is remembered. What is remembered shapes what is believed. And once belief is formed in this way, it does not need to be defended. It remains. There is no moment where the wife fully understands what has happened. No single point where she can turn back and identify where the shift began. Each step was too small. Each change is too subtle. Each reaction is too easily explained on its own. But together, they form something else. Something that cannot be undone by returning to any one moment. Because it does not belong to a single moment. It belongs to all of them. There is something deeply quiet in that realization. Not loud, not immediate, but present. A slow awareness that what surrounds her no longer responds in the same way. That's what she says no longer carries the same weight. That's what she is, no longer defines how she is received. And there is no clear way to return. Because nothing was taken. Nothing can be given back. The mistress does not stand in victory. She does not declare success. She remains where she has always been. Composed. Measured. Unchanged in appearance. There is no visible claim to what has occurred. No acknowledgement that anything has been altered. And yet, something has, not through action, through feeling, through the quiet shaping of how one woman is seen and how another is not. There is no sound of triumph, no final moment that signals completion, only a stillness that feels different from the one that came before, more settled, more certain, as though what has been built no longer needs to be maintained with the same care. Because it has already taken hold, the court continues, uninterrupted. Its rhythms remain steady, its structures intact, its appearances unchanged, and within it, lives continue, but not in the same way they once did. Not for her. No weapon was ever raised. Yet something irreversible had already taken place, and as each small moment gathered into something that could no longer be separated, the outcome no longer needed a single cause. What had been shaped through perception had already settled deeply enough to remain even without being seen. The room grows quieter now, though nothing in it has truly changed. Candles burn low against the walls, their light softening the edges of everything they touch. Fabric rests without movement. Shadows stretch gently across the floor, and the air feels still in a way that does not demand attention. You can almost imagine standing there, just for a moment longer, not part of what happened, not responsible for what unfolded, only present, watching how something so quiet could leave such a lasting mark. There is something about these stories that does not end when the scene fades. They linger, not loudly, not in a way that asks to be remembered, but in the same quiet way they were built. Through small details, through passing thoughts, through the subtle realization that what feels stable is not always what remains unchanged. And perhaps that is why they stay, because they do not rely on sudden endings. They settle, gradually, until they feel like something that has always been there. If you find yourself still thinking about it, that is not unusual. These moments were never meant to be dramatic. They were meant to be quiet enough to pass and strong enough to remain. For now, though, it is enough to let it rest. Let the rooms empty. Let the voices fade. Let the weight of what was never spoken drift gently into silence. There is no need to hold on to it. No need to follow it further than it needs to go. You can leave it where it is, right here. And as the night settles in around you, you might notice how everything begins to slow, the same way it did in those halls, where nothing seemed urgent, where everything moved at a pace that allowed each moment to pass without force. That pace can follow you. You do not need to carry anything forward. Not the tension, not the uncertainty, not the quiet weight of what could not be changed. Let it fade. Let it soften. Let it become distant enough that it no longer asks for your attention. And as you begin to drift, there is no need to search for meaning, no need to return to what has already settled. Just allow the stillness to remain, allow the quiet to hold, and allow yourself to rest within it. Good night.